All right, thanks everybody for joining us today. We're just getting started as we get in here today. Welcome to our webinar. We'll be discussing understanding prioritization methods for enterprise vulnerability management. This webinar is a part of an ongoing effort by Nucleus to help educate. Ooh, hold on a second. Sorry, I had some reverb. But we will be focused on, in this webinar, talking about vulnerability prioritization methods for enterprise vulnerability management. It's an ongoing effort by us to help in being a leader in the vulnerability management space and educating the market on different approaches. My name is Patrick Garrity. I do security research and also the VP of marketing here at Nucleus. And we have some great guests joining us as well today. So I'm excited to welcome and introduce a guided discussion between three industry experts, and all of which share a passion about vulnerability management and vulnerability research. We will be sharing during this webinar some of the research Charl has performed with Orange Cyberdefense, which I'm excited about, and it should be a very, very fun time. So thanks so much, and thanks for your patience as we get started. We have about an hour for the discussion, and just want to encourage people to submit questions using the Q&A button. Feel free to react with emojis, say hi. Thanks for all those that are already saying things in the comments. Also, I think it's important to know it's an international audience. This is early for for us in the States, and I'm a little bit out of breath because we're a little bit late in getting started. So thanks for being patient. But I want to encourage everyone, since we have an international audience, we have 3 different continents represented today with our participants, which is great. Feel free to share what country you're attending from if you want to, if you're comfortable with that. And with that, we'll get started. So as far as the introductions in the panelists, I want to thank you guys for joining as we talk about vulnerability prioritization and vulnerability management. Our panelists are practitioners, researchers coming from Nucleus Security and our partners at Orange Cyberdefense. Thank you guys so much for being a great partner. So first up, we have Steve Carter, CEO and co-founder of Nucleus Security. Steve spent his career building vulnerability management programs, technologies, and tools for large enterprise. And I can attest, Steve plays a pretty active role in our research and development at Nucleus Security today. So welcome, Steve.
Thanks, Patrick. It's great to be here. Thanks for being here, everyone.
Awesome, exciting. And next we have Catherine Boddy. Catherine Boddy is the head of Vulnerability Operations Center, known as VOC, at Orange Cyberdefense. And leads efforts in UK and South Africa, and has many years of experience in security operations and vulnerability management. Hey, Catherine.
Hey, Patrick. Hi, everyone. Looking forward to today.
Awesome. It's great to have you. And you're I think you mentioned you're out of UK, right?
Yeah, that's correct.
Today. So that's exciting. And lastly, we have Charl van der Walt, Global Head of Security Research Unit at Orange Cyberdefense, which identifies, tracks, and analyzes developments in the security landscape. And previously, Charl was a co-founder at SensePost, a penetration testing company that's recognized globally. And I think also something that's exciting to me is he worked with Haroon from Thinks there, which is pretty cool. So welcome, Charl.
Thanks, Patrick. Long-time listener, first-time caller.
It's great. And you're based in South Africa, correct?
Yeah, I'm in Cape Town, South Africa. It's winter here, but we still have great weather.
Awesome. Well, hey, I'm looking at the comments right now, and it's great. We have people from Yorkshire, Wales, Morocco, Germany, Kazakhstan, Belgrade, Serbia, Germany, Netherlands. So it looks like Spain, more Argentina. Wow. So we have at least 5. Well, that's pretty much all 5 continents, which is great to see as far as those engaging. One thing I do want to highlight, Charl, you've done a lot of research that we're going to be talking about today. A lot of that research we're pulling is from a talk that Charl did at Insomniac 2023. We'll share that video in the YouTube, the YouTube video and the link in the comments, so you can watch it afterwards if you want. And then also, we're going to share the LinkedIn accounts for everyone so you can connect with them. Riley will do that in the comments in both LinkedIn Live as well as Zoom. So with that being said, thanks so much for everyone attending and participating. We're going to get started, and we're going to start with a question. We're going to be talking about vulnerability prioritization as a whole, which I'm excited about. Orange Cyberdefense has hundreds of customers within their managed VM program. And Catherine, you operate that program. So I'd love to hear a little bit about how most organizations are working with OCD. And when they come to Orange Cyberdefense, how they're thinking about vulnerability management and vulnerability prioritization.
Yeah, so I think one thing we definitely need to look at is there is no customer that's exactly the same as the other one, especially when it comes to prioritization of assets, for example. You could have something that's a critical vulnerability for one customer that another customer may think is a low vulnerability. Especially after kind of like the Log4j situation that happened. One thing we found in particular during that was customers were just contacting us asking for a once-off scan just to scan against Log4j. And it's like, but hang on a minute, you've got all these other vulnerabilities that are present in your environment. Why don't you let us show you what we do, how we do it, and how we use Nucleus so that you can prioritize your environment and you can deal with those vulnerabilities that you've got. Another thing that I think is really important is customers generally come to us when there's nothing in place. They need something built up from scratch. They need us to help them. They've got no clue what's present. They have literally no idea at all. And I have been in many a meeting when you show a customer exactly what is present in their environment, and the look of shock on their faces is unbelievable, especially when it comes to kind of like key stakeholders in the business. Another thing, I think Nucleus really helps us when it comes to the prioritization because it gives that good customer interface for everyone. You could be someone who's not technical and you can still use it because it gives that good, friendly overview. And yeah, I think that's a good way to sum up our customers, really. They're unique, and that's the best thing about them.
That's great. Yeah, I think it's interesting. You know, everyone has a unique environment, and I think always when you're starting to look at how to get better visibility into vulnerabilities and consider prioritizing them, there seems to always be a lot of times the shock moment of, oh, we didn't realize that this type of stuff's in our environment. So, hey, Steve, shifting over, to you, you've worked with a lot of federal agencies and large enterprises, and I'm curious to hear from your perspective, like, what are some of the challenges that you see historically with federal agencies and enterprises as it relates to vulnerability prioritization?
Yeah, well, so when we got started with Nucleus, this is going all the way back to 2016. A lot of our design, a lot of our features were influenced by large federal organizations and the problems that they were facing. And when we kind of pivoted over to the private sector and commercial organizations, we were a little bit concerned because we didn't know how well those challenges would align with the same challenges that just normal private sector enterprises have. So we were completely wrong and surprised to find out that the challenges that federal agencies face and how they manage vulnerabilities and prioritize vulnerabilities, it's largely the same problems that any large enterprise would face in any kind of highly regulated industry. So, problems of communication and collaboration across the organization, problems of how do you scale the processes that you've defined to achieve the outcomes you want. How do you aggregate all of this data and normalize all this data from a whole lot of different siloed systems and scanning tools and things like this? This is all, these are all the problems we see today. This is all the problems we saw back then, both with federal organizations and with private sector organizations. The only thing that I can tell really that's uniquely different about the federal organizations is that there's a really heavy focus on compliance and in particular NIST compliance 853 controls, 800/171 controls, things like that. They put a lot of focus, a lot of energy on compliance with those controls, and so they're looking really closely at configuration and misconfiguration of systems, probably more so than we see in just normal large enterprises that are managing vulnerabilities. But other than that, they're really similar, I would say.
Yeah, I think it's interesting as we get into some of the discussion and the research, right? Software and applications a lot of times in federal space and enterprises live on for a long period of time, which just tend to increase risk and exposure. So, Charl, I'd love to hear your perspective at being a practitioner and also spending a lot of time on the research side. What have you seen over time as far as some of the impact and how we should consider looking at vulnerability prioritization?
Yeah, so I think that both Catherine and Steve have touched on important points. I think Catherine made the point that customers are all different, and so when you're trying to spend your security budget, invest your resources, it's very difficult to come up with a single formula or strategy that works for everyone. But Stephen made the point that in some ways, some things are universal. And one of the things that we see in our data and the other reports that we look at is that we have a universal challenge with mitigating vulnerabilities on scale. And it seems pretty horrific given the amount of time we've been trying to solve this problem to see just how poor we actually still are at it. And I think our latest study, as you said, across our hundreds of customers, suggested it takes our customers on average 215 days to patch a vulnerability. I think it was like 186 days for a serious vulnerability. And that doesn't really vary from industry to industry. And Steve, correct me if I'm wrong, but I suspect you're going to see the same thing in the federal space. As sorry, I've maybe jumped the gun there, Patrick, a little bit, but yeah, that's the chart. When I got the numbers right, 184 is the number for criticals. I suspect that's the same across between the private sector and in the federal space. The compliance probably making it more complex for federal agencies. And so there is, as a result of that, the sense that, look, we're just not getting to all these vulnerabilities, certainly not with any kind of reasonable amount of time. And that in turn then raises the question, well, how do you prioritize? How do you decide what am I going to focus my effort on, and what's the smartest way to do that? But that in turn, I think, is a decision that can be informed by standards and research. But probably also needs a strong component of organizational ethos.
Yeah, and I think the one thing I'd add to that, and Charl, correct me if I'm wrong in the research you've seen, but as alarming as some of those numbers are with the dwell time and the age of vulnerabilities, I think that over the years and over time, those numbers have actually gone down pretty significantly, right? And I do agree that across industries and even from what I've seen on the Fed side, those numbers are pretty consistent. I think the 180 days and the 220. But I want to say I've seen research over the years that really show the trend is going down. I don't know that it's going down fast enough, and I'm definitely not comfortable with 220 days for patching a critical vulnerability. But yeah, I do think things are improving. So there is hope.
Absolutely, and we looked at, for example, not in so much in the vulnerability management space, but in the pen testing space. We did a study to see how much effort it takes a pen tester to uncover something significant to report to a customer, to put it simply. And there's clearly a downward trend there. An upward trend in that case. In other words, it means the pen tester has to work significantly harder now than they did before. But I think, as you were alluding, if you look at suggestions regarding how long it takes a vulnerability to evolve from being discovered to POC to weaponized exploit to seen in the wild, we're talking days, maybe a handful of weeks. So those 186 days, it is looking better, but it's a far cry from being okay.
100% agree. And we saw this, the Move It, the in progress Move It one is fresh in my mind. I'm sure you guys are talking a lot about that one as well. And it's exactly what we saw there, where I think CISA put it on their list early June, maybe June 1st or 2nd. And then about 10 days after that, we saw public exploits on GitHub. So yeah, things move really fast in days and weeks, not months, for sure.
But even though they're moving that quickly, people are not jumping on and patching it. They're not jumping on and rectifying it. I mean, there's probably millions of assets now that have still got that vulnerability on that could quite easily be compromised. And it's just about taking that time. That there isn't time, really. It's something that needs to be done urgently more than anything.
Right.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. Like, I think the Barracuda firewall that got deprecated, like similar extreme scenario, but like, I gotta imagine there's still thousands of people using email gateway, not firewall. That still like they might not even know, right? Or even realize. And so I think that's a real challenge, is people even having an understanding or knowing. And I think some of that has to do with resourcing too. So as we're talking about and diving a little bit deeper, I think there's a few things which is on the threat side or risk. Well, I wouldn't say risk, but have to be careful on how we use our terms. But there's different prioritization methods that we're going to talk about a little bit. CVSS, Common Vulnerability Scoring System, EPSS, Exploit Prediction Scoring System, and then CISA KEV, the Known Exploitable Vulnerabilities List. Charl, when you were talking about, and I had that chart up a moment ago with the time to patch, is that criticality based on CVSS, or is that based on something else?
Yeah, I spotted that question in the chat also. No, so that's based on the static CVSS base score, not on exploitability. We haven't done a large scale study based on exploitability yet, but watch the space. I think our team and several other research teams around the world are drooling all over EPSS and the insights it might be able to give us. We've already done some studies that prove to be like absolutely interesting, and I'm looking forward to what else we're going to see there.
Yeah, so I think, I mean, hopping into that and starting to go down the path of exploitation a little bit, and just so everyone knows, if you're not familiar with CISA KEV, CISA is the US's cyber security infrastructure security agency. There was a bidirectional operative, which means basically like a rule put in place by the US government that people need to patch and remediate vulnerabilities that are put on this list called the KEV, Known Exploitable Vulnerabilities List. And what's awesome is the US government not only has shared that with federal agencies, but it's public, so everybody gets visibility. And I think it's the thing that excites me so much about it is like, it's probably the one place for the first time where there's an authoritative source that you can trust that's publishing exploitable vulnerabilities. So I pop up this chart, Charl, you've done some research in looking at Orange Cyberdefense clients, right? On how pervasive known exploits that or known vulnerabilities that have been exploited are within Orange Cyberdefense customers. So I'd love to hear from your perspective, maybe talk through a little bit about this chart and what you're seeing.
Yeah, thanks. I love this chart because I find it fascinating, and I hate it because I find it extremely hard to explain. But as you pointed out, KEV is a fascinating new tool that allows us to identify a subset of vulnerabilities where a trustworthy authoritative figure has said, look, these are being exploited in the wild. These are the things you need to worry about. And so, of course, we became interested to understand how exposed our customers were to those vulnerabilities. And at the time that we did this, kind of late last year, there were 860 vulnerabilities in the KEV, 862 or something. It's grown since then, but at the time there were 862. And basically what we did is we took those 862 and we searched for them at each of our customers. And if we saw one of them, we would tick it off, if you like. And the chart tries to show what proportion of the KEV was seen at what proportion of our customers. We thought that looking at a proportion of our customers was a reasonable baseline for, for assessing impact. And if you start on the right-hand side of the graph, basically what it says is that 52% of the KEV was seen at none of our customers. So we could take more than half of the KEV and toss it away and say, our customers aren't exposed to this at all. It just doesn't occur anywhere, not on a single host, which I thought was astounding to start with. And then you can just see how rapidly it drops after there. And effectively, there's small little bits of the KEV that are then, that we could identify very small portions of our customers, often just handfuls. A handful of customers have got this vuln, a handful of customers have got this grouping of vulns. Except for that curious bump in the middle where you see sort of between 12 and 15% of our customers are exposed to about 25% of the vulnerabilities in the KEV. And those were interesting because really those are clusters of vulnerabilities that are all Microsoft related. So they're all Microsoft vulnerabilities, and they're all very old. They tend to be families like, SMB version 1 vulnerabilities or Bluekeep, so quite things that we knew about very well. And for some reason, those clusters of vulnerabilities have just persisted at about a quarter of our customers and just have never been addressed for years and years and years. And then you just get this long tail where, almost half of our customers have got a handful of vulnerabilities in the KEV. I think it's just raises some fascinating questions. That bump in the middle with the old Microsoft vulnerabilities that aren't being patched, obviously makes you wonder why that is, how have they persisted so long. We've been reporting them, that's why they're in the data. So the customer knows about them. They've got high CVSS scores. They should really have been addressed, but they haven't been. But then equally interesting is that long tail where almost half of our customers have just got a couple of vulnerabilities from the KEV. And so on the one hand, you go, well, actually, most of the KEV we can ignore. It's never going to affect us. On the other hand, you go, well, people are being owned using these vulnerabilities. And if even one of them exposes me, then that's enough, right? That's enough for me to be popped. So that's kind of what we read from this chart.
Hey, Charl, I remember reading I think it was a blog post where you talked about this in pretty good detail. And if I recall, it was a really small number of vulnerabilities from the KEV that have ever been discovered through the pen tests that you guys do at OCD, right? And I want to say you looked at like 1,000 or 2,000 different pen tests and only saw, less than 10, maybe.
Yeah.
Does that sound right?
That's absolutely right. Yeah.
And I just want to point out that when I saw that, the very first conclusion I came to and thought that I had was OCD must be doing a really fantastic job at managing vulnerabilities for its clients, right? And I know that wasn't the conclusion you were trying to extract from all this, but I think it's probably a very valid point because that number was super low for that amount of pen testing activity, at least in my opinion.
Yeah, you raise such an interesting point, because we could bring three perspectives to our research. We could bring the perspective from KEV and from EPSS that said, look, this is what we're being told is being exploited in the wild. This is how people are being owned. And then we could say, of those, which are actually exposed at our customers? Which of our customers stand any chance of ever being owned by this? Because they have that technology or they have that service, whatever the case might be. But then we could go a step further and say, look, we do these thousands of pen test engagements, and I'm just going to come out and say they're high-end engagements. We don't do rote pen testing. We do deep aggressive pen testing, So how many of those vulnerabilities are actually being exploited? And I don't have the numbers at hand, but they were so small that I struggled to graph it. And there was you couldn't do a chart because the numbers were just too small to do a chart. The only one that really stood out, to Catherine's point from earlier, was Log4j, which is being used in the wild, was being discovered on the customer networks, and was actually being exploited by pen testers.
I had on that note, it's like constantly I hear people like, why didn't you fix it? Oh, it's just an extra server that's hanging out there that we don't consider as that important. And I think it's an important note. It's like, that's a foothold into your network. And so I think like people are overlooking that. And then I guess my question, and maybe this is more for Steve, because I have my own opinions, but what's your opinion on how people should be using the KEV today within enterprise vulnerability management?
Yeah, so here's the thing, right? The Kev list is fantastic. It's a fantastic signal for the reasons that you guys point out. But it's similar to any other threat or vulnerability intelligence feed. It's non-trivial, especially in a large enterprise with these silos of scan data. It's non-trivial to correlate that list with all of your data. So if you can do that, if you've got the luxury of doing that, and that's obviously what we do at Nucleus, shameless plug, but if you can do that, I think I like the KEV as kind of the very first decision-making point to say, are any of the vulnerabilities that we have in the KEV? Because if we know that they are, we should probably do something about that very quickly, right? Going back to the Move It vulnerability that showed up in the KEV. We know it was being exploited, I think now or sometime in May. It showed up in the KEV around June 1st or 2nd, I believe. And then, even looking at things like EPSS and other threat intel feeds that are great. I want to say EPSS, the score was very, very low until mid-June when we started to see the GitHub public exploit code show up. And so if you were just going by EPSS, you would have scored it very low. It wouldn't have met the threshold until mid-June. That's too late. So I really like the KEV as kind of that first pass of, all right, we just scanned everything. We did our weekly scans of everything, or we're continuously scanning, and we're constantly plucking out the needles from the haystack that are those vulnerabilities that are in the KEV list, and especially if they're impacting assets that we know are exposed publicly or via the internet.
And I think the important thing to note here is, Charl, your research actually shows this should not be a large list. And I think I was talking to Stephen Schaefer's in the comments. I think it was him or maybe someone else that like essentially the KEV should be an inbox 0. Ideally, you should try and get anything on the KEV out of your environment because it's known as exploited with high fidelity, right?
Yeah.
So that, I love it. Great place to start.
The only little bit of color I'll add to that is that when you look at the KEV list, there are a lot of vulnerabilities in there that pretty much any vulnerability management vendor or threat intel vendor will all agree are low risk. Right. So there is an argument to be made in there that, yes, these are being exploited, but the impact is so low that you could have higher priorities. And that's a debate you can have probably at another time. But I just wanted to throw that in there.
Yeah. Hey, I'm gonna move on to EPSS, but I do think that there's an aspect of analysis paralysis sometimes, but not always. And then there is the assessing risk, right, as far as what's a priority. I think it's a balance on that front myself. So, Charl, what were you going to say?
No, I was just there was a comment in the chat about, what the obstacles are to patching. Why is it not happening? What are customers saying? And I just wanted to bring that to Steve's point about KEV as a inbox 0 construct. We have customers who use KEV exposure as a KPI in vulnerability management. So have we achieved inbox 0? And I can't answer the question of why it's so hard, but I can tell you that their KPI goal is not 0. They're not even trying to hit 0 on the KEV. they've got a higher threshold than that. So to the question about why it's so hard, Steve, I imagine you'll have better insights than me, but I suspect it's a fundamentally hard problem that emerges out of organizational complexity. It's not a problem that emerges out of a lack of vulnerability intelligence.
100%, Charl. What I've seen the most, honestly, is that with our customers, they as well don't have. Well, I shouldn't say they don't have a lot of KEV vulnerabilities. I'll say that the assets, the number of assets impacted by KEV vulnerabilities is generally very small. But oftentimes they'll have dozens of KEV vulnerabilities, and the reason is that they've got some legacy stuff hanging around, right? If you've got Windows 7 hanging around, you're going to be impacted by
2008,
30 plus. Yeah, you're impacted by so many vulnerabilities on the KEV, but it might be that you only have 3 of those workstations hanging around, and they're hanging around for a very specific purpose. But you've implemented some compensating controls around them, and so you're managing the risk. All right, but you're still not going to get to inbox 0 with KEV in that scenario.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, something happened. I don't know if you guys are aware. Back in the UK, I think it was last year, it was uncovered that the NHS were basically running Windows XP on all of the things, and you're thinking, oh my God, it's the National Health Service for the whole country, and you're turning around and telling me that you're on Windows XP. Like, we've had multiple since then, so what's going on? Like, they're kind of horrible. I mean, it could be dangerous what they could actually do with that, really.
Well, and that was after they got destroyed by WannaCry.
Exactly.
Yeah, and I do think that, like, the purpose of the Kev List is in at least the U.S. government and federal agencies to build accountability so that doesn't persist necessarily. So that's one of the things I'm excited about is, like, yes, CISA is actually holding accountability for people to upgrade these old systems that are exposed and exploited or have confirmed exploits. So, like, that, in theory, it's almost like an audit function if you think about it, which is pretty cool. And that also then builds out to the federal contractors, people doing work for the government on these systems. So, hey, I want to, being mindful of time, I want to hop and talk a little bit about EPSS and some of your research. Just so everyone knows, the exploit prediction scoring system is a SIG special interest group run by first.org. And there's a large group of people that are essentially correlating different sources of information regarding vulnerabilities, and then exposing a score of a probability of a vulnerability being exploited over the next 30 days. And so, Charl, you've done some research as far as high probabilities, and I'd love to hear a little bit about what you've seen across customers and how people might consider using EPSS for vulnerability prioritization.
Yeah, so EPSS is a newish construct and a very exciting initiative by First. They have a big fat old machine learning model that's processing, I think it's 1,500, but it's growing all the time, different attributes of a vulnerability, looking at the vulnerability itself, but also looking at internet telemetry, reports, characteristics, whether it's been published on GitHub, et cetera, and then they use that to produce a probability score. Now, of course, the question then becomes, well, what probability concerns us? We're only 100%, we're only concerned about vulnerabilities where it's 100% likely, or is it 70 or 50? That is to Catherine's point about customers are unique. That's results are going to vary. But it's generally considered that anything above 30%, so 0.3, is where you want to start paying attention to a vulnerability, and particularly as you see it trending upwards, it becomes more and more worrying. So we looked at I think this was from EPSS version 2 still. We looked at CVEs, which at the time that we did this had a probability score of 3 or above. And again, we did the same thing. We said, how many of our customers would be impacted by any of these vulnerabilities? And again, you read the graph, I think most easily from the right, which was it was 95% would not be impacted. We couldn't find a single vulnerability with an EPSS of over 0.3 at 95% of the customers that we looked at. But then again, like with the KEV score, you get these this long tail. But overall, the number is that only about 2% of our clients would have been affected by a vulnerability with an EPSS score of higher probability score of higher than 0.3. And there's a very small number of vulnerabilities that have to deal with. And just to make a comment, Steve, you pointed out, I think quite graciously, that your first thought was that our vulnerability management services must be really good. And of course, we're proud of them, but I don't actually think that's the defining characteristic here.
Yeah,
I don't think that's, much as I'd love to say it, I don't think that's what this graph is saying.
we should.
I just think what it's illustrating is, sorry, Catherine.
I mean, here's what I will say. I know that number that you chose of 0.3, I think there's somewhere around 7,000 or 8,000 vulnerabilities that are a 0.3 or higher, right? Out of the 200 or something thousand that if you consider all of, let's say, the NVD. And I mean, those numbers look really impressive to me. We look at a lot of customer data. I haven't gone and checked this and compared it to what we see on our side, but to me, those numbers look really impressive, right? If I'm managing a large enterprise, I would want those numbers. So I think everyone.
Well, there you go, Catherine. You can take it as a compliment.
Yeah, give Catherine and Charl a call if you want those numbers.
But I think to Patrick's point, I think what it's more illustrative of, in this context at least, is just the efficiency that EPSS brings to your vulnerability prioritization. So that jump from 200,000 to 7,000, of which only a portion will be impacting your assets. And I think to one of the questions that just came up on the chat, only a proportion of those will be exposed on the internet. Then suddenly this tidal wave of risk that you have to consider in terms of specific real or near to real time threats, that becomes a much more manageable problem.
Right.
So I think, between CISA KEV and then EPSS, both those are incorporating, threat intelligence into consideration in addition to vulnerability context, right? And I think a lot of the side of the vulnerability, traditionally people have used CVSS scoring. We have an interesting question, and I'm curious. This is we've got this a few times in the chat, so maybe this one's for you, Steve. There's a good question about, hey, what are your thoughts on Tenable VPR scoring, Qualys True Risk, right? And how do those fit in as well? And I think there's 100 other scoring systems that we're seeing developed and released. And I think there is a misnomer of like a silver bullet concept in risk scoring going on. But what's your take on different prioritization methods?
Yeah, risk scores, the risk scores you mentioned, Tenable's risk scores, Qualys risk scores, these are actually really good scoring mechanisms. But the problem with them is that they only work in the ecosystem of those vendors, right? And that's why I look at EPSS and kind of value EPSS, because it's something that can easily, it could easily replace risk scores. And I know the EPSS guys would probably cringe if I said that, because it's not a risk score. It's only looking at the threat piece, but I would say EPSS is a better approach for a larger enterprise that wants to do things in a consistent way and make decisions about prioritization in a consistent way, because EPSS can be overlaid and correlated to all the vulnerabilities in your enterprise. I say all of them, not some AppSec vulnerabilities, but all the traditional network and infrastructure vulnerabilities that you might have and be discovering with different tools. So you don't have to, you don't want 5 or 6 different vendor scoring algorithms running across your enterprise. It's really hard to understand. I mean, it's really hard to understand a lot of these scoring mechanisms anyway. And look, Nucleus has a risk score too, but most people most customers of ours can't explain exactly how the score is what it is very well. You know, I have to dig in pretty deep. A lot of vendors' scores are kind of black box. So I think EPSS is nice in that sense that that you can use it to stack rank vulnerabilities, as Charl was mentioning, and say, hey, just show me everything that's above a 0.3. That's a very small percentage that are highly likely to be exploited. And one could argue that could override vendor risk scores. So that's kind of how I think about it at this point.
I mean, I think
go ahead.
Oh, sorry, Patrick. I was just going to say, I think that the other thing that we really like about EPSS is its accessibility. Because we as researchers, we can pull it any time, right? And we can pull it for any vulnerability. But even more interestingly, we can track it over time. So one of the studies we're doing at the moment is to look at CVEs that have been reported by our incident response teams. So CVEs that have been linked directly to an incident, and to then look at, what was the trajectory of the EPSS score in and around that time. And that's something that you can do with something that's, beautifully time sequenced in the way that EPSS is available. And I think where that translates to enterprises is not so much for research, but for modeling and scenario building. So you can run different mitigation strategies using that data and model it out and give yourself a tool to test different approaches to risk management using that perspective on exploitability.
Yeah, and just to add to that as well, I think especially where it's only been around 4 years now, it's still technically new. People are looking into it now, but I can see 4 years further down the line, it's going to be something that everyone's going to be using. It's going to be one of the main things we're going to be looking at for the prioritization of the vulnerabilities.
100% agree. And by the way, shameless plug for the EPSS guys. I think they are now taking donations. It's a nonprofit group. It's all volunteers that maintain EPSS. It's a big, thriving, kind of healthy group and community. But it's not supported by a government or any specific funding. And so and yet it appears to be probably the best. The best data source out there like this. And again, in my opinion, definitely better than stack ranking or prioritizing with CVSS base scores, and arguably better than even with vendor risk scores. So yeah, go donate to EPSS.
Hey, I agree as well. I mean, it's really important to the ecosystem. You see, vendors like ourselves adopting it. I think Sneak added EPSS lately. A bunch of other vendors, so it's becoming really important to the ecosystem. And I think there's a big movement of like this as an alternative to the CVSS base score, not completely replacing CVSS as like there's value in some of the attributes and different things. And reality is risk scores use a lot of those attributes a lot of times. But taking a little step, so we've talked about some of the vulnerability aspects, and then we're talking about threat aspects to vulnerabilities. A lot of people are asking about what about asset context and actually truly assessing risk. So Steve, I'm curious, to hear your thoughts as far as like now extending and taking some of these different intelligence sources, to extend how we start looking at assets to really consider risk to an organization.
Sure. I mean, I guess I'll just start by saying that I think from most organizations today, still, this is very much a crawl, walk, run type of situation. And most of them are still focused on just trying to figure out how to get the right threat and vulnerability enrichment into their programs and make decisions, right? So that said, we do see a lot of organizations using some basic kind of asset context and information like network exposure. We talked about that. Asset criticality. Those are two big ones that we see being part of the decision making and prioritization processes. But if I'm looking forward, I think we'll probably see more and more folks, and I'm starting to hear organizations talk about this more and more. People want to assign real dollar values to assets and work towards calculating the financial risk of each vulnerability for prioritization purposes, which is a really interesting area, risk quantification. And I personally have never seen anyone do that well, any organization do that well. A lot of them have lofty goals there, and I think we'll get there. But to me, a lot of the ways that we get there are around how we incorporate asset context. And anyway, another area I think we might see kind of more use of asset context is prioritizing vulnerabilities based on regulatory compliance that might be in effect for specific assets. So in a lot of enterprises, I'm sure you guys see this too, you've got some subset of assets with different regulatory compliance requirements that have different SLAs and whatnot. And so how you prioritize certain types of vulnerabilities on a device that's subject to PCI might be significantly different than how you prioritize vulnerabilities on a device that may have no compliance regulations applied to it. So those are just a kind of a few things that come to mind, Patrick.
Yeah, and just to add to that as well, Steve, I think something we see, especially as a PCI ASV, is obviously they still use CBSS version 2 at the moment until they're upgraded. But one thing we've noticed, especially like as soon as a vulnerability is classed as a medium, it's a fail. That's it. The CBSS score defines everything. There is no grey area when it comes to PCI. So I think one thing we've noticed a lot from our clients, especially ones that we've got the PCI and the normal vulnerability scanning for, is you'll see them kind of stick to more the regulatory requirements that they need to, as opposed to what's coming in, because they know that that's sorted. They know that that's going to pass the PCI, that's going to get them what they need. So
it's unfortunate.
It is unfortunate, but this is the world we live in. There's probably still people with J's vulnerabilities that need to be patched.
Absolutely.
Hey, so Charl, I think you created this, and this is an interesting perspective as far as looking at risk reduction and threat mitigation. Do you wanna walk us through this visual?
Yeah, I must just caveat by saying I did it on Sunday morning at a coffee shop. This is not a particularly well thought through piece of work, but I can maybe introduce it by just a follow-up comment on host. What do you call it? Asset value as a metric. As a pen tester, I was a pen tester for about 15 years. You're reminded all the time of this truism. It was published by Microsoft some years ago that defenders think in lists and attackers think in graphs. And sadly, you guys are complicit. We're complicit in that also, because we give our customers lists. There's a list of vulnerabilities, a list of assets. But the attacker really is, I think, moving through an organization a little bit more like water. It always finds the easiest path. So the problem with the problem with assigning value to an asset as a form of prioritization is that that's very likely not the way the attacker is going to get to that asset, right? They're going to pop some asset, elevate privileges, pivot from there, boom, 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 and they end up where they want to be anyway. So that makes it much more complex to figure out, which assets do you want to patch and which don't you? But where I think asset characteristics or asset attributes come into play in perhaps a more interesting way is when you think about how you can patch efficiently within an organization. And by efficiency, I mean, how do you reduce risk with the least amount of effort? And what we've been talking about so far is the idea that you can use vulnerability prioritization systems to say, well, what represents risk, which is one part of the efficiency equation. But the other part of the efficiency equation is what represents effort, right? Or what affects effort. And what affects effort is generally like, what kind of platform is it? Do I have automatic patching in play? How easy is it for me to reboot it? Can I take it out of production for any given amount of time? What's my relationship with that business unit like? How stable is it, et cetera, et cetera. There's a whole lot of other attributes of the asset which may affect the efficiency equation. And so, Patrick, finally getting to your point, it occurred to me in preparing for this webinar that I think part of the mistake we make is by thinking about prioritization as one thing. And I think vulnerability intelligence is a form of intelligence that can direct a strategy. And I think the starting point is to say, well, what are the goals that I want to achieve? And I kind of in this picture roughly broke it up by saying, I think we've got risk reduction goals, which basically is overall, how do I reduce my exposure as efficiently as possible, as with the least effort. And the threat mitigation is how do I mitigate threats with least time, right? Because to Catherine's point, you've got to be doing it fast. And so basically, I think what this picture, the story that this picture tries to tell is that I think you start off with sort of two very different perspectives that you're going to have different strategies for, and you're going to use the intelligence for in different ways. The one is about risk reduction, and the other one is about threat mitigation. Threat mitigation is very concerned with the asset attributes. Risk reduction may be less concerned with their asset attributes and maybe more concerned with organizational issues. Anyway, whatever those strategies are that you choose to pursue, and they will be directed also by things like compliance imperatives, Steve. Then you've got various forms of intelligence. The one that's overlooked all the time is asset intelligence. Log4j, the big question was, what do we have that got Log4j on it? It's not so easy to scan for. So do we know? What do we have that could be, if EPSS starts trending up, what do we have that could be impacted by this vulnerability? Then there's attack intelligence. So I would put Kev into that category. Then there's vuln intelligence. I would be inclined to put EPSS into that category. And then threat intelligence is, we know this actor is doing this thing and they're targeting your organization. And then depending on your strategy, I would argue you've got different kinds of metrics. So threat metrics, obviously very time-based, very focused on exposure to the internet, exposure to the adversary. But risk metrics could be different. They could have to do with effort, for example, over time, and maybe you measure those completely differently. And then given those metrics, then I think you can develop different tactics. And for threat mitigation, the tactics are relatively simple. Turn it off, put it behind something, patch now. Those things I think are pretty call the IR teams because we're in deep shit. I think those are all relatively simple. But risk mitigation tactics, I think, can be much more nuanced. And there, I think you can think differently about things. I might say, well, I'm going to work with a business unit and we're going to do a vulnerability management week, or I'm going to understand what the patch management cycles are of this BU and plug onto those. And then I don't really care how serious the vulnerability is. If it's a Windows 8 machine, I'm just going to patch all the OS vulnerabilities. Let's just get them done. Why do I care what they are? Or can I move, Catherine's point of XP, we've seen lots of customers like that simply don't have budget. Maybe the risk reduction strategy is to say, let's get budget to upgrade our old systems. I don't care about the EPSS of XP, etc. So I won't go into that too much more, but then just to say that those exercises, I think, should then be re-informing your asset intelligence. So can I learn more about the assets that I have? And I think in a reciprocal punt to you guys, I think what's wonderful about a platform like Nucleus or something similar is that it can sit squarely between those two strategies, but you're using it as a tool to direct that strategy. You're not using it as a clock that defines what your actions are. It's not like, new vulnerabilities score higher than EPSS, therefore I must do this. And you can use the dashboards and the dingbats and the widgets and all of those things to go, what should I be doing in terms of the strategy today, this week, this month, etc. I hope that makes sense.
I mean, that makes a ton of sense to me. I mean, what I think of as you're speaking, Charl, is something we talk about a lot with our customers, which is just at the highest level, do you have a vulnerability management plan and program actually defined, actually documented, that captures your strategy, your approach to vulnerability management, who your stakeholders are, what their roles are, what the goals of the program are. And in most cases, those things are not documented. And if they are, there's some lightweight kind of documentation that was just a checkbox to satisfy some compliance initiative. And so I think that's really important, even to your point about getting budget, right? Unless you can kind of bring the organization together to get aligned on, here's how we're going to do things, here's how our approach. here is what our approach is at a high level, and then down into the rest of the organization. It's hard to get budget for things, because how can I give you budget if you can't really quantify and tell me exactly where we're deficient, where we're not meeting our goals or achieving the outcomes we're looking for. And so, of course, you can always point to, hey, we don't want to get hacked and things like that. But we always try to encourage organizations to really think about these things more deeply. We don't talk about strategy enough, right? We talk about more of the kind of tactical things. So I think we could talk a whole nother hour about that. Maybe
we'll do more. I do think one of the things that's coming up with that is how organizations make decisions on vulnerabilities. We will plan on doing one of the frameworks I really like, webinar on stakeholder specific vulnerability categorization, because essentially that is building out decision trees. And so I think that's an important thing to consider as far as how we look at within an organization vulnerability management and getting that sort of alignment. Being mindful, we're close to that time. So, first off, I want to thank you guys for participating in this discussion. So thanks so much, Steve, Catherine, and Charl. Thanks everyone for attending as well. I want to highlight a few upcoming things that we have going on. Hopefully this is helpful, discussion and just considering what methodologies you might consider using for vulnerability prioritization approaches, things like EPSS, CISA KEV, threat intelligence, and so forth. Don't hesitate to reach out to any of us directly if you have any questions, about our roles and how we can support your organization with vulnerability management in partnership with the Orange Cyberdefense and Nucleus. As far as some of the fun stuff's coming up, Black Hat and DEF CON, of course, are a hot topic. So, Catherine, do you want to highlight what Orange Cyberdefense has going on at Black Hat this year?
Yeah, thanks, Patrick. So from our ethical hacking team based in South Africa, our fantastic training team are going to be delivering some courses at Black Hat, Ring Zero, and DEF CON. You can see all the lists of all the courses below, and we are doing lots and lots of promotion about them on LinkedIn. If anyone does have any questions, feel free to reach out to me directly or email the training email that's just featured at the bottom of the screen.
Sweet. We'll be at Black Hat as well, hanging out at Mandalay Bay, if anyone wants to connect too. So it's cool to see you're doing a bunch of trainings. And then lastly, just want to leave everyone with next month. So we do a monthly webinar next month. We're having a discussion about preparing for cybersecurity resilience and incident response. I'm excited about this with Aaron Joe at Mandiant, part of Google Cloud. I think a little bit different perspective. So we talked a lot about vulnerability prioritization, vulnerability management. This is a topic that I think is interesting, of like how to engage, for instance, government entities when you do have an incident, third parties, that sort of stuff. So please feel free to register. I think the link is going to be in the comments in just a moment here. And just want to thank everyone from a participation perspective for joining today as we continue on this monthly series of webinars and roundtable discussions. So thank you. Any last things you would like to leave people with in regards to quick tips on vulnerability prioritization? Silver bullets, anyone?
Ooh, no silver bullets. That's my
yeah, there you go. Amen.
That's where I'll leave it.
Get off the hamster wheel. Get off the hamster wheel, let's say. Think about how you can get off the hamster wheel. Don't let the noise direct your day, I used to play a lot of team sport, and the coach would always say, play the game at your own pace. I think that's where you want to get to.
Couldn't agree more there on that one, Charl. I think that's perfect.
All right, we'll leave everyone with get off the hamster wheel, and there's no silver bullets. Thanks so much for attending today, and have a great week, and we'll see you in August.
All right, it's been fun.
Thanks,
everyone.
Next time. Thanks, Steve. Thanks, Patrick.
Cheers.
Thanks, Catherine.
Bye.
Bye.